Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Stevens, and this is the Psychology to Live By podcast.
Welcome to Psychology to Live By. In this roundtable, we're going to discuss the second in my podcast series entitled Staying Composed in Disturbing Times. And this one is on developing equanimity psychologically. And joining us today, we have my very equanimous friends from Nettwerk Music. Terry McBride, Chairman and CEO, Colin Novak, Artist Manager, Chris Norwood, Chief Strategy Officer, and Karen Mix, Director, People and Operations. But first, a summary of the podcast. Well, many of us are finding contemporary life unsettling. This podcast focuses on psychological pathways to equanimity, and we covered a lot of ground in that podcast, including the serenity prayer, or God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We also talked about the freedom that potentially lies in the space between stimulus and response, the power to choose our response, again, as exemplified by the Viktor Frankl very famous quote, and that is that between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I also examined the role of courage and the role of values in equanimity. We discussed mindfulness and the Buddhist notion of the sacred pause, and how this can be applied by what I call the two conditions test. And finally, we saw how all of these strategies are diffusion strategies, in that we disidentify or diffuse our identity from automatic thoughts and feelings. And we do this in favour of a more equanimous and wise response. But now, to my very composed friends from Nettwerk Music. All right, here we all are on this very auspicious day. I believe a fairly large bill has been passed in the United States. That's got a lot of people talking. It's not irrelevant to what we're going to be discussing today, more in general. How are we all? Look at that. Slightly longer podcast this time. It's quite a deep topic, and so I'm of course very curious to know what you made of it and what questions and observations, insights that you have. Who would like to go first?
I guess that's me.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Well, it is. It's a challenging day, but I think this is really relevant to everything that is happening, well, all over the world, but
Yeah.
in America for sure. And so many of the details that you discuss, I found very really stood out to me. Choose how you respond, and you will learn from that response. So I think that, there are some things you can control and some things you can't control, and how you respond to it is the only thing that you can control. So I think, and also just, playing a bit of the victim, you have to find the positive. You have to learn, do what you can to make the changes in your own small little world.
Yeah, there's a few jumping off points there, Colleen. Might start with the last thing you're talking about, that sort of playing the victim, because I saw somewhere recently that the two words trauma and victim are two of the most searched for words on the internet, contemporary internet, and there's a lot of, I think, kudos that people can get, in it's a kind of negative virtue signaling. I'm a bigger victim than you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it puts people in a position where they can't be questioned, right? Because I'm a victim, right? And it's actually a fairly insidious psychological trap, because it locks people into being unhappy because they have to be as a victim, right? And whenever we fall into that, even in more subtle ways, where we're certain we've been wronged and the other person is the wrongdoer, we then continue to suffer because we have to maintain the victim role. And I saw this play out in a very dramatic way many times. I used to do investigations into what we call psychological injury claims, or workers' compensation claims based on psychological injury. And the person who put in a claim, they have to have a clinical diagnosis in order to get the insurance, basically. And so there's a fairly perverse incentive for them to get sicker, if you know what I mean. They often start off really unhappy. There's things going wrong at work, whatever. But really, I don't think they're clinically ill, but they shop around till they get a diagnosis. But then they actually become more and more sick. So because their identity starts to get to change to an illness identity. And so I think I think that's a general process, and I think we've got to be careful about a similar process here, that if we view ourselves as completely victims and having no agency, we get unhappier and unhappier and unhappier. Does that make sense, Colin? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you just don't learn anything from mistakes or experiences. And yeah.
No. And so that's one part of it, I think. The earlier thing you said there too was about choosing. And again, if a person sees themselves as a victim, they will argue till they're blue in the face that they have no power to choose, that it's been done to them, and that there's no mediation of their mind, as it were, in whatever the troubling events are. Now, I hasten to add, as you know, in the first podcast, and I made reference to it in the second, my model of reality plus mindset equals experience. The reality is in the equation.
Mm.
There are aversive things that happen in life, things that are unpleasant. It might be a gigantic, ugly bill. Yes, so it's not to say that those things aren't real and they don't constrain the possibilities in life. Any reality constrains possibilities in life. But there are an infinite number of ways one can respond to any reality. Now, of course, we react very quickly. And we react out of two things, out of whatever our genetic and personality makeup is, and we react out of whatever we've practiced in, whatever we've learned that runs off pretty automatically as well. And we've got instinctive things as well. So there's a lot of ways in which we don't think very much. We just have our reaction.
Yeah. And like we talked about in the last one, it's so important to have some space from it.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, and that space between the stimulus and the response, if there's no space there, it's probably better put as stimulus reaction. But what turns it into a response is having that space to make some sort of choice. And the choice, in my view, should be determined by our own philosophy, our own values, our deeply held beliefs. Am I behaving in a way that's consistent with what I believe is the right way to be? And very often it's not.
Although, yeah, you mentioned my ideas are always are right, but always.
That's
That's the
right.
only
Oh,
thing I disagree about.
that's true. It's interesting. The other thing, I didn't mention it in this podcast, but I was thinking about it before we got on. You guys might remember a thing talked about ages ago called the Fundamental Attribution Error. Do you vaguely remember that? Not really. It's like this. Let's say, I don't know, if someone else does something bad, the fundamental attribution error is we attribute that bad act to a bad character. They're a bad person. If we do something bad, we explain it via circumstances. Oh, yeah, I was tired and it was a mistake or there were all these factors, right? So this fundamental attribution error, it's called fundamental. It's sort of like because it's universal, right? And so we all do it. And if we think about this idea of my ideas are right sort of thing, we tend to. It's not just that; it's that other people's. It's not only their ideas are wrong; they're bad people, right? And I think one of the things that can help us, and I'll talk more about this in the next podcast, move to a more civil dialogue, is to understand the role that the fundamental attribution error plays in the deep polarisation and the vitriol that people are throwing at each other, because there's a certain moral righteousness on both sides, which actually causes people. It's a thing called reactance. It causes people to double down on what they're thinking, right? So not only does it change their point of view, it deepens it, which would be the opposite of what you would call effective action. All right, I know we've got four of us to get through, and I took a long time there, Colleen. But I hope some of that rambling was useful.
Of course. Yes. Thank you.
Who's next?
What really resonated with me was when you said emotional freedom lies in the space between stimulus and response. You said that a couple times in the podcast, and that just was like, wow. I do. It's interesting because I feel like you do need a very high level of emotional intelligence or maturity to grasp that concept. So, regardless of thinking of it in my own kind of the Karen world of dealing with different personalities in my life, like they're just not going to get there. But if I can get there and just reminding myself of that, okay, pause, what's the stimulus and what is my response? So that just was, yeah, that I'm going to write that down and stick it somewhere.
Yeah. It's again, there's a lot of lovely things to talk about here. I was interested in the phrase your current world because I think that could have a slightly different meaning if but I think we'll just talk about your world. Yes, emotional intelligence, I think, is what you mentioned there. It's not as easy as it sounds, obviously, right? Because we're designed to operate mostly in the world pretty automatically, as we should, right? So somewhere in the podcast, I think I talked about this issue of course, most of the time it's perfectly fine to not be consciously mediating every reaction we have, because very often our reactions are perfectly apt. They suit the circumstance, that they're helpful. So it's more when we, or roughly as a rough guide, we're experiencing negative emotions. We lose our equanimity. That's when we take that as a cue. Now, it does take practice, and it's interesting working therapeutically with people. Very often, this is what you're actually ending up teaching people, even if you don't even talk about it this way. When people first come into the therapeutic situation, they're deep into suffering usually, And there is no gap, but there's no space for them to intervene in they're completely identified with whatever the thoughts are that are keeping them unhappy, right? And again, I'm not saying there aren't things in their life that need to be worked on, but just generally speaking, they're completely identified with the negative feelings and the negative thoughts. It's a revelation when people get it that there's an intelligence that we all have that can step back, as it were, and almost like slow time down between the stimulus and the response, and that you can decide how much you want to be upset by the unpleasant reality. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. I think I've told you all the time. My wife lectured me quite appropriately when I was very upset with my teenage son, and her question to me was, "How long are you planning on staying upset?" At first, I was really pissed off at her because it was obvious it wasn't my fault. I was the victim of my son's behaviour, right? And then, of course, but part of me knew that was not right. She was right. She's always right. And that I was keeping the upset going. I would, just my mind just kept generating all the reasons I should stay upset. Mm-hmm. And when knowledge is power, it's an amazing thing. Not as in facts, but just in understanding psychologically, when you realize that the large majority of our suffering is caused by our attachment to why we must be suffering, and you take that attachment away, then the need to suffer goes away. Now, this is not about becoming inhuman. I think we still get triggered, in the immediacy of it, and that's a good thing, because it alerts us to real things in the world, but as the Buddhists say, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And I think that's the distinction we're talking about here. There are bad things happening in the world, but how much we suffer from them's up to us. And the other thing around emotional intelligence, I think, is that it's always a work in progress. So it's not like you just do it once and you're enlightened. You got to practice it and practice it and practice it, and it's almost like as you practice it, to use an analogy, it's like you've got a microscope and you're getting a microscope of greater and greater magnification, so you can see more and more clearly. It looms larger in the mind how we're constructing our own upset, and then it just melts away. As soon as you see that, it melts away. Now, it might come back as a new thought comes to mind, but then you zoom in on that again and you see, oh yes, that's just me upsetting myself. And like anything else, the more you practice it, it becomes instantiated as a routine in the mind and the brain, and after a while, the ideal is after a while it runs itself. It becomes the default, mm-hmm. that you take upsets as this immediate cue to examine the way you're upsetting yourself, and hopefully just drop it quicker and quicker and quicker. That's the plan, Stan.
Great plan. Great plan.
Yeah. Gentlemen.
Yeah, so I really appreciated this podcast, in part because it had a lot of tangible things that people could put into practice as they navigate through the challenges and situations that the world throws at us. And some of them we've talked about in the past. The reality mindset equals experience, certainly as a formula, is something that I find myself constantly defaulting back to. The sacred pause. And even the comments from Colleen and Karen so far today, which I've just also been just like jostling down notes as we've been going. and they all kind of point to, at the end of the day, it's sort of techniques to insert yourself in front of your sort of lizard brain reaction or around your lizard brain reaction,
Yeah.
which, is, I sort of was, as I was watching the podcast, I was sort of like, yeah, how do we get everybody to do this? And it's sort of like, that's not really the point. The point is like, if I can do it, that makes like that at least I can manage myself and my own happiness in the realm of the world. And if that extends outwards to other people, of course that makes things better, but I shouldn't automatically default necessarily to getting the world, because that's that circle of control thing, right? And
Exactly.
but as we switch over into that really kind of mindful approach to how we manage our responses to this stimulus, it theoretically makes us more open to new information that doesn't challenge our identity, right? Which really seems like it's at the root of a lot of a lot of what's happening is like people have their identities so closely tied to these sets of beliefs, and that sense of identity that they fear like they might lose if they are wrong. Is there, I don't know where I'm kind of going with all this, but it just like I think the idea here is I can navigate myself first. And if I can be open to new information and think about the world critically and be constantly reevaluating my positions, at least that gives me a clearer lens through which to navigate the world.
Yeah. And this is I think, a really interesting dilemma that we all face, because it's natural for the mind and intelligent of the mind to think about the big issues, the big problems, the geopolitical things, the world issues, climate change, and to feel like, well, I'm powerless to change that. And it feels morally wrong in some ways to not to ignore it, or but that can be very disabling. That can move us immediately into just feeling helpless and hopeless. And if I'm sort of with you though, Chris, in one sense, obviously the world would be a much better place if everyone, or a large majority of people, had a measure of emotional intelligence in the sense that we're talking about here, in the sense that they could disengage from their negative emotional reactions a bit, and from the fundamental attribution bias, and from, and I think, politically around the world, we'd have a different world, right? Because there'd be much better dialogue, there'd be better information exchange, better decisions would be made. We'd be voting in and keeping accountable our leaders, et cetera, et cetera. But so the more people that we converse with and open up dialogue with, hopefully there's a rippling effect. With respect to humans, though, I don't know. I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I think it would be to say that my experience is that we learn via suffering. Like, we don't always learn from suffering, but if we're going to learn, it's usually via suffering, via mistakes, via things. If you think of the deepest learnings, but that gives me a sense of hopefulness, because if eventually human beings do wake up, generally speaking, not before harm has been done, right?
Yeah.
And it'd be nice to avert the harm and with foresight, but so it's natural, is what I'm saying, to be thinking about. But we need everyone to wake up. But of course they're not. And then the next best thing is to do exactly what you were describing. we're ultimately responsible for our own emotional lives, and that has a profound impact on everyone we touch. And that is a wonderful thing. It's amazing, even when you're doing small things, like, for example, people who do volunteer work, maybe a local community thing. It's not going to change climate change immediately. It's not going to change who votes for whom in the United States. It's not going to change, the wars that are going on in the world. But people report when they're doing that kind of just very real personal assisting of other people, that regardless of what's happening in the world, they feel better.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's sort of it's utilising our natural wiring. We're designed to live and work with small groups of people, fairly intimate, and to assist each other, right? And I think when we do that, it sort of brings us back to kind of normal psychology. And then you can look out at the larger issues from that space and see it more objectively and with more equanimity, right? And I think it then actually collectively, the more people who do that, the more collective action that people will take that's effective, right? If there's a genius in the way that populism is contaminating political discourse around the world, it's in generating a feeling amongst people that it's hopeless. Their most potent effect is to make people disengage from the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think equanimity leads people in the opposite direction, because they're coming from a place where they're actually thinking more clearly and more objectively, and they will act and talk to the people around them in ways that actually are more effective in terms of moving along the conversation and moving along the world. Have I vaguely answered your question?
Yeah. I don't even know if I had a question so much as a meandering train of thought, but yeah, I hear you 100%.
Yeah, well, we're kindred spirits there, very good at meandering trains of thought. And Terry, are there any meandering trains of thought in your fertile imagination?
I think Colleen, Karen, and Chris covered off so much of what was in the podcast that was really interesting, especially the sense that there's tools, which I thought was great. The one thing I wanted to lean into was not directly covered. It's that power to choose part, which is a very key element of the overall picture, and how it's being, in a very strange way, compressed and whittled down through social media, through news outlets, through the dissemination of information, and you're either here or you're there or nowhere else. So the middle's getting lost, and that power to choose is in my view being affected by the two tribes of you're in or you're out. No discourse is allowed. And even if I read today about a couple hundred people from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, saying, hey, this kind of decisions getting made here are not correct according to the actual science. All of those people are effectively terminated like a week later for disagreeing with one side, purely based on scientific fact. And then you've got these news channels that are pushing just part of the story, not the full story. So people are not getting all of the information. So their power to choose is actually being shaped to fit a certain narrative. And
okay, so I think there are two intersecting dimensions to the power to choose. There is the psychological power to recognize one's own immediate reactions and to step back and reflect, and thereby maybe choose a more salutary or more constructive way of framing something. So I think that's the psychological one. And you're quite right. That's what I focused on in the podcast. But of course, what you're discussing, and this might actually be a very fruitful thread to take up in another podcast, is this more sociological dimension where it penetrates the psychology, but it's a way of controlling information, and thereby affecting the content of people's choosing.
Yeah, it's like curation.
Yeah, and so that, of course, is still relevant to our internal psychology, because our own choices are only going to be as good as the information that we've got to process. And just to come back to the fundamental attribution error for a bit, it's really easy to hate people if we fall into the fundamental attribution error, because we look at their beliefs and their thoughts and we think they're monsters, right? Or they're idiots, or some other horrible epithet. But if we see it from the lens that you're describing here, it's like, oh, well, if I was in their situation, if I was in that echo chamber, if I was in that network of dialogue and conversation, I probably would think like that too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's to step beyond the fundamental attribution error to kind of go, it's an empathic reach, into what it is like. And then, I don't have to hate them. I have to hate, if I'm going to hate anything, or I have to oppose the system that's doing that to us. That's the media systems, the politicians, the manipulators that are keeping people in apart from each other, having real dialogue, right? And I'd use hate there, not as, that would be crazy that I'm talking about filling ourselves with hate in a podcast on equanimity, but you see what I'm getting at? It's like that's the thing that we have to overcome. So there is a very interesting, I think, relationship between the quality of our knowledge and our ability to self-transcend our reactions. If we don't have the information, very often we'll be going down not very constructive paths. And this is an argument for science, for education, for knowledge, because it can liberate.
Yes.
I mean, it's the whole point of this podcast. It's like to say, we've discovered a few things that actually turn out to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they can help us mediate whatever reality is coming at us. Yeah. All right, my friends. Like I always say, you don't disappoint.
Mm-hmm.
We are all living in this world that is challenging in many ways. But in a sense, this roundtable is a kind of microcosm of what we're talking about as well. It's the way that we can settle ourselves as we reflect on what's actually important, what's real, friendship, laughter, the exchange of ideas. All of these things give us equanimity. Hopefully we're all feeling a little bit better at the end of this conversation than we were at the beginning.
I think we always do, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
It's
I
kind
think
of like
so.
a self-help group.
I know. I mean, our hope, of course, is that people beyond us also have the same experience.
Psychology Anonymous.
That's right. The 12-step group.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, my friends. Well, as always, thank you so much, and we'll catch up again soon. Take care. You've been listening to the Psychology to Live By podcast. If you'd like to know more, my website is www.drchris.life, and click on the videos tab to find links to all my social media. And if you like the podcast, tell people that you like, so they can like it too.